I'm the man whose own daughter told everyone I was dead to save herself from embarrassment. She stood at my funeral, crying crocodile tears while I watched from across the street. 3 years later, when she needed $500,000 for surgery that would save her life, guess who came knocking? But by then, I wasn't the broken man she'd buried. I was someone entirely different, and the power to save her was completely in my hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The call came at 2 in the morning. I hadn't heard that ringtone in 3 years, the one I'd set specifically for family emergencies back when I still had a family. The phone vibrated against the nightstand in my Chicago penthouse, pulling me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in weeks. I almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail like I had with every other call from that area code. But something made me reach for it. The voice on the other end was shaking, desperate, nothing like the confident, cold tone I remembered from our last conversation. It was my former sister-in-law, Margaret, and she was crying. "Leo, please don't hang up. I know you have every right to, but Sarah needs help. She's dying, and we don't know what else to do." Sarah, my daughter, the same daughter who had orchestrated my social death so thoroughly that even my own neighbors attended my funeral. I sat up in bed, my mind instantly sharp despite the late hour. "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong number," I said, my voice steady. "Leo Winters died 3 years ago. I attended the funeral myself." Margaret's sob echoed through the phone. "Please, Leo, the doctors say she needs surgery within 2 weeks or she won't make it. The treatment costs $480,000, and insurance won't cover it. You're the only one who can afford it." I almost laughed. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The same daughter who had been so ashamed of her working-class father that she'd faked his death was now depending on his money to save her life. I hung up without another word. But sleep didn't come back. Instead, I found myself standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, looking out at the city lights below. 3 years ago, I was Leo Winters, the plumber from Riverside who worked 60-hour weeks to put his daughter through medical school. The man who lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and drove a 15-year-old pickup truck. The man whose hands were permanently stained with grease and whose back ached from crawling under sinks. That man was dead, just like Sarah had told everyone. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It started 6 months before my supposed death when I received a call that changed everything. My Uncle Marcus, my father's brother who I hadn't spoken to in 20 years, had passed away. We'd had a falling out when I was young, something about family pride and choices I'd made. I was too stubborn to reach out, and apparently so was he. But Marcus had been watching me from afar. The lawyer who called me into his downtown office that day had papers that made my head spin. Marcus hadn't just been the black sheep of the family living somewhere in Europe. He'd been building a financial empire, investing in technology startups when they were just ideas scribbled on napkins. By the time he passed, his portfolio was worth north of $200 million, and he'd left it all to me. The condition was simple but strange. I had to assume a new identity for at least 3 years. Marcus had included a letter explaining that he'd watched me struggle, watched how people treated me because of my profession, and he wanted me to understand what it felt like to have power, real power, the kind that came from money so vast that people's attitudes toward you shifted completely. I thought it was crazy. I was 52 years old, set in my ways, with a daughter I adored and the simple life that worked for me. But then Sarah graduated from medical school, and everything changed. The first sign was the invitation, or rather, the lack of one. Sarah was having a graduation party, and I found out about it from Mrs. Chen, my neighbor, who mentioned seeing it on social media. When I called Sarah to ask about it, she was evasive. "Dad, it's just a small thing with my classmates. You wouldn't know anyone there." But I knew the real reason. I'd dropped her off at school enough times, met her friends enough times to see how their expressions changed when they realized who I was. The maintenance man's daughter, the plumber's kid. They were polite, but there was always that moment of adjustment, that slight shift in their posture that said they were recalibrating their opinion of her based on me. Sarah had worked so hard to fit into their world. She'd learned to speak differently, dress differently, carry herself differently. And I understood. I really did. I'd grown up poor too, knew what it felt like to be on the outside looking in. I just never thought she'd decide I was the thing standing between her and the acceptance she craved. The final straw came 2 weeks after her graduation. I'd saved up for months to buy her a gift, something special to commemorate all her hard work. It was a vintage medical bag from the 1940s, beautifully restored, with her initials engraved on a small brass plate. I'd found it at an estate sale and spent 3 months' worth of weekend overtime paying for the restoration. I called her to arrange a dinner where I could give it to her, but she kept putting me off. Finally, I decided to surprise her. I drove to the upscale restaurant where she was celebrating her residency placement with friends. I dressed in my best clothes, the suit I'd bought for her high school graduation, and walked in with the gift bag. The look on her face when she saw me wasn't embarrassment, it was horror. She quickly excused herself from the table and met me at the entrance. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to give you this," I said, holding out the bag. "I know you've been busy, but I thought we could celebrate together." She glanced back at her table, where several young doctors were watching us with barely concealed curiosity. "Dad, this isn't a good time. Can we do this later?" But I could see it in her eyes. There would be no later. Not in public. Not where her new colleagues could see. I handed her the bag anyway. "Congratulations, sweetheart. I'm proud of you." She took the bag, but she didn't open it. She didn't smile. She just stood there looking like she wanted to disappear. That night, I went home and called Marcus's lawyer. Within a week, I was learning how to be someone else entirely. The fake death was Sarah's idea, though she didn't know I knew. I'd hired a private investigator to keep tabs on her, not out of malice, but because I needed to understand how far she was willing to go. The PI recorded her conversation with her boyfriend, Dr. Bradley Thornton, the son of a prominent surgeon and the kind of man who'd never dated a plumber's daughter. "I can't keep making excuses," she'd said. "He's going to want to meet my family eventually, and what am I supposed to say? That my dad unclogs toilets for a living?" "So what's the solution?" Bradley had asked. "I've been thinking, what if something happened to him? Not really, but what if people thought it did? A heart attack, maybe? He's been working so hard, and he's not exactly in great shape." The recording was crystal clear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. My daughter, the woman I'd sacrificed everything for, was planning to erase me from existence. So I helped her. I staged my own death with the precision of a military operation. The lawyer Marcus had left me had connections that ran deep. People who specialized in making problems disappear, or, in this case, making people disappear. We faked medical records showing a history of heart problems that I'd supposedly hidden from Sarah. We created a timeline where I'd collapsed at work, been rushed to the hospital, and died before anyone could reach me. The funeral was elaborate. Sarah played the grieving daughter perfectly, accepting condolences from people who barely knew me but felt obligated to pay their respects. She even gave a eulogy about what a wonderful, hard-working father I'd been, how proud she was to be my daughter. I watched from a rental car across the street, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap. The whole thing lasted 43 minutes. By the end of it, Leo Winters the plumber was officially dead and buried. But Leo Winters the multimillionaire was just getting started. The first thing I did was move to Chicago and buy a penthouse in one of the most exclusive buildings in the city. Then I bought a wardrobe that cost more than I used to make in a year. I hired a personal trainer, a stylist, and a voice coach. If I was going to be someone else, I was going to do it right. The transformation was more than physical. I enrolled in night classes at Northwestern, studying business and finance. I read voraciously, everything from the Wall Street Journal to biographies of industrial titans. I learned to speak their language, to think their thoughts, to move in their circles. Within 6 months, I was unrecognizable. The rough hands were soft now, manicured and free of permanent stains. The slouched shoulders were straight and confident. The working-class accent was replaced by the neutral, educated tone of someone who'd attended the right schools and belonged in the right places. I started investing, using Marcus's fortune as seed money for ventures that seemed impossible but paid off spectacularly. I had a natural instinct for seeing opportunities that others missed, probably from years of figuring out creative solutions to plumbing problems. By the end of my first year, I doubled Marcus's initial investment. But the real change wasn't in my bank account. It was in how people treated me. Suddenly, I was interesting. My opinions mattered. When I spoke, people listened. Restaurant hostesses smiled genuinely instead of looking through me. Store clerks treated me like a valued customer instead of someone to be watched suspiciously. I understood what Marcus had been trying to teach me. Money wasn't just currency. It was power, respect, and the ability to be seen as fully human by people who would have otherwise dismissed you. Meanwhile, Sarah was building her new life. Through the PI, I watched her relationship with Bradley progress. She moved into his downtown apartment, started attending charity galas and medical society events. She fit in perfectly, the brilliant young doctor with the tragic backstory. Her father's death had become a conversation starter, a way to garner sympathy and show her resilience. She never talked about me the way I actually was. In her version, I'd been more successful, more educated. She embellished my background, turning me into a small business owner instead of an employee, a contractor instead of a plumber. Even in death, she couldn't bear to let people know who I really was. The irony was that while she was pretending I'd been something I wasn't, I was actually becoming everything she'd wanted me to be. I was respected, wealthy, influential. I moved in circles where Bradley's father was just another surgeon, not the pinnacle of success. And I was careful to make sure our paths never crossed. Chicago's elite society was smaller than people realized, but with the right planning, it was possible to avoid specific people. I knew Bradley's schedule, knew which events he and Sarah would attend, and made sure I was always somewhere else. For 3 years, I lived this double life. By day, I was Leo Winters, successful investor and philanthropist. By night, I was the dead man who watched his daughter build her life on the foundation of his absence. The money kept growing. Marcus's initial fortune expanded into something genuinely vast. I owned pieces of companies across dozens of industries, had real estate in 7 countries, and had enough liquid assets to fund a small nation's budget. But I never forgot where I came from. I donated anonymously to trade schools, funded scholarships for working-class kids, and quietly paid for the medical bills of families who couldn't afford them. The plumber in me never died, even if everyone thought he had. I thought I could continue forever, living this parallel existence where I was simultaneously dead and more alive than I'd ever been. Sarah seemed happy. She'd gotten everything she wanted without having to carry the burden of an embarrassing father. I had resources and respect beyond my wildest dreams. Then Margaret called. After hanging up on her, I couldn't get the conversation out of my head. Sarah was dying. The daughter who'd killed me to save her reputation now needed the very thing she'd been so ashamed of, her father's love and support. But I wasn't that father anymore. That man had died in a hospital bed that existed only on paper, mourned by people who'd never really known him. The man I'd become had different priorities, different loyalties. I called my attorney the next morning. "Robert, I need you to look into something for me. Sarah Winters, resident at Northwestern Memorial. I want to know everything about her medical condition and her financial situation." Robert had been handling my affairs since the beginning. He was discreet, efficient, and asked no questions when I made unusual requests. By afternoon, he had a complete report. Sarah had been diagnosed with a rare form of cancer that required an experimental treatment only available at a handful of medical centers. The procedure itself cost $480,000, not including the months of follow-up care and medication. Her insurance classified it as experimental and refused to cover it. She'd applied for grants, started a crowdfunding campaign, and asked every wealthy person she'd ever for help. She'd raised less than $50,000. Her boyfriend, Bradley, had contributed $10,000, the same amount he spent on his car payment every month. The cruel irony was that she was dying from the stress-related cancer that her lies had helped create. The constant pressure of maintaining her false identity, the anxiety of being discovered, the guilt of what she'd done, it had all taken a physical toll. She had 8 weeks to live without the treatment. I sat in my office that afternoon, looking out at the city where I'd reinvented myself. The old Leo would have immediately arranged for the money to be transferred, no questions asked. He would have found a way to help his daughter without her knowing where the money came from, just grateful that she would survive. But the old Leo was dead. The man I'd become understood that some debts couldn't be paid with money alone. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I drove to Riverside, to the neighborhood where Leo Winters the plumber had lived. The apartment building looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier. Mrs. Chen was still there, watering her plants on the front steps. She looked up when I got out of my car, and for a moment I thought she might recognize me. But the transformation was too complete. She just smiled politely and went back to her flowers. I walked up to the 3rd floor, to the apartment where I'd lived for 15 years. Someone else lived there now, but I could see through the windows that they'd painted over the marks on the doorframe where I'd measured Sarah's height every year. Standing there in my $1,000 suit, I felt like a ghost visiting his own life. Everything that had mattered to Leo Winters was gone, erased as if it had never existed. Except for one thing. The daughter who'd killed him was dying, and she needed him to come back to life. I made my decision that night. The next morning, I called Margaret back. "I've been thinking about our conversation," I said. "I might be able to help." Her relief was audible. "Oh, Leo, thank you. I knew you wouldn't abandon her, no matter what happened between you two." "I didn't say I was going to help," I corrected. "I said I might be able to. There would be conditions. Anything, name it."
Sarah has to ask me herself, in person, and she has to tell me the truth about why we stopped speaking. There was a long pause. "Leo, she thinks you're dead." "Then I guess she'll be surprised to see me." I gave Margaret the address of my Chicago office and told her to bring Sarah there at 2 o'clock the following Tuesday. Then I hung up and began planning for the most important meeting of my new life. The office was on the 62nd floor of a building that scraped the sky, all glass and steel, and the kind of view that made people feel simultaneously powerful and insignificant. I'd chosen it carefully for this moment. The old Leo would have met her in a coffee shop or a diner, somewhere comfortable and familiar. The new Leo received visitors in a space that immediately established the balance of power. I arrived early and positioned myself behind my desk, a massive piece of black granite that had cost more than most people's cars. The wall behind me was covered with awards and photographs from charity events, images of me shaking hands with governors and senators and CEOs. None of the pictures showed Leo Winters the plumber. That man had been erased so completely that he might as well have been fictional. At exactly 2 o'clock, my assistant announced that I had visitors. I told her to send them in. The door opened, and Margaret walked in first. She looked older than I remembered, grayer, with worry lines that hadn't been there 3 years ago. But it was the woman behind her who took my breath away. Sarah looked like she was dying. The vibrant young doctor who'd graduated at the top of her class was gone, replaced by someone fragile and hollow-eyed. She'd lost at least 20 pounds from a frame that hadn't been heavy to begin with. Her skin had the grayish pallor of someone whose body was failing, and her hands shook as she walked. But it was her expression that hit me hardest. When she saw me sitting behind that desk, her face went through a series of changes. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that might have been terror. "Dad?" she whispered. I didn't get up, didn't move, didn't smile. Just looked at her with the same neutral expression I used for business meetings. "Miss Winters," I said formally, "please have a seat." She stumbled toward the chair in front of my desk, Margaret supporting her elbow. When she sat down, her legs seemed to give out completely. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "You're supposed to be dead. I went to your funeral. I buried you." "Did you?" I asked. "Or did you bury the man you were ashamed to call your father?" The question hung in the air between us. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but Sarah just stared at me like she was seeing a ghost, which, in a way, she was. "Margaret tells me you need money," I continued. $500,000 for a medical procedure that will save your life. That's quite a lot of money, more than a plumber could ever afford. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Dad, I can explain." "Can you?" I leaned back in my chair. "Can you explain why you told everyone I was dead? Can you explain why you were so ashamed of me that you literally erased me from existence?" She was crying now, but I felt nothing. The old Leo would have been around the desk in an instant, holding her, comforting her. The new Leo had learned that some pain needed to be felt fully before it could be healed. "I was scared," she whispered. "Scared that people would judge me, scared that they'd think less of me because of where I came from." "And do they?" She looked up at me confused. "Do people think less of you because your father was a plumber, because he worked with his hands, because he didn't have a college degree or a trust fund or the right last name?" "I thought they would." "So you killed me to find out." I stood up and walked to the window, my back to her. "You murdered your own father to escape the possibility that someone might look down on you." "I didn't murder anyone." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, with a flash of the old Sarah, the one who'd never backed down from an argument. I turned back to face her. "Didn't you? Leo Winters the plumber is dead. I have the death certificate to prove it. I have newspapers with his obituary. I have a headstone with his name on it. If that's not murder, what would you call it?" She didn't have an answer for that. "The funny thing is," I continued, walking back to my desk, "you were right to be ashamed of him. He was weak. He let people walk all over him. He sacrificed everything for a daughter who couldn't wait to get rid of him. He was pathetic." Sarah flinched as if I'd slapped her. "But the man sitting in front of you now? He's everything you wanted your father to be. Wealthy, respected, powerful. He moves in circles where your boyfriend's father is just another surgeon. He has influence that reaches into places you've never dreamed of." I sat back down and looked at her directly. "So, which father are you asking for help? The dead one you were ashamed of, or the living one you don't know?" The silence stretched between us for a long moment. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "I was wrong." "About what?" "About everything. About you, about what mattered, about who I wanted to be." She wiped her eyes with a tissue Margaret handed her. "I thought I needed to be someone else to be worthy of respect. I thought you were holding me back. And now?" "Now I'm dying, and I realized that none of it mattered. The people who looked down on you weren't worth impressing. The life I built on lies isn't worth living." She looked up at me, and for the first time since she'd walked into the office, I saw something other than fear in her eyes. I saw the little girl who used to wait up for me when I worked late, who'd insist on helping me fix the sink even though she was too small to hold the wrench properly. "I don't deserve your help," she said. "I don't deserve anything from you. But I'm asking anyway, not because I think I'm entitled to it, but because I don't want to die with this between us." I studied her face, looking for any sign of manipulation, any hint that this was just another performance. But all I saw was someone who'd finally understood the cost of her choices. "The procedure costs $480,000, I said. She nodded. "I'll pay for it on one condition." Hope flickered in her eyes. "What?" "You tell everyone the truth. your boyfriend, your colleagues, your friends. You tell them that your father isn't dead, that you lied about who he was and what he did for a living. You tell them that Leo Winters was a plumber who worked 60 hours a week to put you through medical school, and that you were so ashamed of him you faked his death. The hope in her eyes died. I can't do that. It would destroy everything I've built. Everything you've built is a lie. My career. Your career is built on your skills as a doctor, not on who your father was. If people judge you for where you came from, they're not the kind of people whose opinions should matter to you. She was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. I could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. Pride versus survival. The life she'd constructed versus the life she might still have. "What if I lose everything?" she asked finally. "What if you don't?" I countered. "What if you discover that the people worth knowing don't care about your father's profession? What if you find out that honesty is actually more attractive than pretense?" I leaned forward, my voice gentler than it had been since she'd arrived. "Sarah, I've spent the last 3 years learning what it's like to have power, real power. And I can tell you that the most powerful thing you can do is stop pretending to be someone you're not." She was crying again, but these tears seemed different, cleaner somehow. "If I do this," she said, "if I tell the truth, will you forgive me?" It was the question I'd been dreading, because I didn't know the answer. Could I forgive someone who'd loved me so little that she'd erased me from existence? Could I look past the betrayal and see the scared young woman who'd made a terrible choice? "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'm willing to try." She nodded, accepting the uncertainty. "Then I'll do it. I'll tell them everything." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a check I'd already written. $480,000 made out to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I slid it across the desk to her. "There's one more thing," I said as she stared at the check with disbelief. "From now on, when people ask about your father, you tell them he's alive and well and very proud of his daughter, the doctor. You tell them he's a successful businessman who taught you the value of hard work and honesty." She looked up at me, confused. "But you are successful. This office, this building, the money for my treatment, all true. But it's also true that I used to be a plumber. Both things can exist at the same time. The man who fixed pipes and the man who writes checks for $500,000 are the same person. The only difference is that now I have the resources to help my daughter when she needs it." For the first time since she'd walked into the office, Sarah smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was genuine. "Can I ask you something, Dad?" The word hit me like a punch to the chest. It was the first time she'd called me that without some other emotion, shame, frustration, embarrassment coloring it. "Sure." "Are you happy with this life, this version of yourself?" I thought about the question. Was I happy? I had everything the old Leo had ever dreamed of: money, respect, influence. I could walk into any restaurant in the city and get the best table. I could write a check for $500,000 without blinking. People sought my advice, valued my opinion, treated me like I mattered. But I also lived alone in a sterile penthouse, surrounded by beautiful things that had no history or meaning. I had acquaintances, but no real friends. Because everyone I met now had only ever known the manufactured version of myself. I was successful beyond measure, but I was also completely isolated. "I'm working on it," I said, finally. She nodded like she understood. Me too. Margaret, who had been silent throughout our conversation, finally spoke up. "So, what happens now?" I looked at Sarah, this daughter I'd lost and found and might be losing again. Now, Sarah gets her treatment, and we see what kind of life she builds with the truth instead of lies. Sarah stood up slowly, clutching the check like it might disappear. "Dad, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but after the treatment, after I tell everyone the truth, do you think we could try again? Not as the people we were, but as who we are now?" I stood up as well, walked around the desk, and for the first time in 3 years, I hugged my daughter. She felt so small in my arms, so fragile, but also real in a way she hadn't been since her graduation. "I'd like that," I said. "I'd like that very much." As they prepared to leave, Sarah turned back to me one more time. "Dad, the plumber who raised me, the one I was so ashamed of, he was a good man. I should have been proud to be his daughter." I nodded, feeling something tight in my chest finally start to loosen. He was just doing his best with what he had. "So was his daughter," Margaret said quietly. "She just lost her way for a while." After they left, I stood at my window looking out at the city that had become my kingdom. Somewhere down there, Sarah was probably calling Bradley, preparing to tell him that everything he thought he knew about her was wrong. She was about to risk losing everything she'd worked for, all for the chance to build something real instead of something pretty. I was proud of her for that choice. Proud in a way I hadn't been since the day she graduated medical school with honors. She was finally becoming the person I'd always known she could be, not despite where she came from, but because of it. The old Leo had been weak, that much was true. But he'd also been honest, hardworking, and devoted to his daughter. The new Leo had power and resources, but he'd lost touch with the values that had made him worth knowing in the first place. Maybe it was time to bring them together. Maybe it was time for Leo Winters to rise from the dead in truth as well as in name. I picked up my phone and called Robert. "I need you to draft a press release," I said. "Leo Winters, the investor, is announcing his background for the first time. I want everyone to know that before I had money, I was a plumber in Riverside. I want them to know I'm proud of where I came from, and that my success didn't start with a trust fund or a college degree. It started with a willingness to work hard and a father who taught me that all honest work has dignity." "Sir, are you sure about this? It could affect how some people perceive you." I smiled, thinking about my daughter walking into that hospital with a check that would save her life, and the courage to finally tell the truth about where it came from. "Robert, the people whose opinions would change based on my background aren't the kind of people I want to do business with anyway." As I hung up the phone, I realized that for the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself again. Not the man I'd been or the man I'd become, but some integration of both. Leo Winters the plumber and Leo Winters the businessman were finally the same person. My daughter had killed me to escape her shame, but in doing so, she'd given me the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to discover who I really was when nobody was watching. Now, as she prepared to live honestly for the first time in years, I was ready to do the same. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The surgery was scheduled for the following Thursday. I didn't visit Sarah in the hospital, but I made sure she had the best possible care. A quiet word with the chief of surgery, a substantial donation to the medical center's research fund, and suddenly every specialist in the building was consulting on her case. Money had a way of opening doors that compassion alone couldn't budge. While Sarah was fighting for her life in an operating room, I was fighting a different kind of battle in boardrooms across the city. The press release about my background had gone live that morning, and the reactions were everything I'd expected and worse. My phone hadn't stopped ringing since 7 a.m. Some calls were from journalists looking for a story about the rags-to-riches plumber turned millionaire. Others were from business associates whose voices carried a subtle chill that hadn't been there the day before. The most telling calls came from people who didn't call at all. I was sitting in my office when Robert knocked and entered with a stack of newspapers and printouts from financial websites. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could read the concern in his eyes. "The coverage is extensive," he said, laying the papers across my desk. "Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Chicago Tribune. The stories picked up momentum on social media as well." I scanned the headlines. Most were respectful, some were admiring, but a few carried an undertone that made my jaw clench. From pipes to profits, the unlikely rise of Leo Winters. Blue-collar billionaire reveals working-class roots. And then the one that stung. Investment guru's hidden past raises questions about industry credibility.
"There's more," Robert said quietly. He handed me a tablet showing the comments section of a financial blog. I read through them, each one a small knife twist. Explains why his investment strategy seemed so unconventional. Makes you wonder what other successful investors are hiding about their backgrounds. No wonder he never fit in at the country club events. But it was the last comment that hit hardest. "My plumber charges me $200 an hour. Guess I know why now." I set the tablet down and looked out the window. The city sprawled before me, indifferent to the small drama playing out in offices and conference rooms across its expanse. Somewhere in that maze of buildings, Sarah was lying unconscious while surgeons worked to save her life. Somewhere else, her boyfriend Bradley was probably reading these same articles and wondering if his girlfriend's father's resurrection was going to damage his own carefully cultivated reputation. "The Pemberton Group called," Robert continued. "They're postponing next week's meeting indefinitely. Harrison Industries wants to review their partnership agreement. And the Blackstone Foundation has questions about your background verification for the board position." Each name was a door closing, an opportunity evaporating. These were deals worth millions, relationships I'd spent years building. The old Leo would have panicked, would have scrambled to do damage control, would have found a way to apologize for being something other than what people expected. But I wasn't the old Leo anymore. "Good," I said, surprising Robert. "Let them review, postpone, and question. Anyone who has a problem with where I came from isn't someone I want to do business with." "Sir, some of these partnerships represent significant revenue streams." "Robert, I once spent 3 hours in a crawlspace fixing a pipe that had been leaking for months because the homeowner couldn't afford to replace the whole system. I charged her $50 because that's all she had. That woman treated me with more respect and gratitude than any of these people ever have." I stood up and walked to my bookshelf, pulling out a worn photo I kept tucked behind a row of business journals. It was Sarah at age 8, wearing a too-big hard hat and holding a wrench almost as tall as she was. She was beaming at the camera, proud to be helping her dad fix Mrs. Patterson's kitchen sink. "This is why I did any of this," I said, showing Robert the photo. "Not for the respect of people who judge others by their bank accounts or their zip codes. I did it to prove that worth isn't determined by the job title on your business card." Robert nodded, though I could see he was still worried about the financial implications. He was a good lawyer and an even better financial advisor, but he'd grown up in a world where perception often mattered more than reality. "What do you want me to tell the reporters who are calling?" he asked. "Tell them the truth. I'm proud of every pipe I ever fixed, every drain I ever unclogged, every late-night emergency call I ever answered. Tell them that understanding how things work from the ground up made me a better investor, not a worse one. And tell them that if they want to judge my investment acumen based on my collar color instead of my returns, they're welcome to take their money elsewhere." As Robert left to handle the media requests, I allowed myself a moment of doubt. Was I being stubborn? Was I throwing away everything I'd built for the sake of pride? The practical voice in my head, the one that sounded suspiciously like the old Leo, whispered that I could have kept my background quiet, maintained the illusion, continued to play the game by their rules. But then I thought about Sarah lying in that hospital bed, finally ready to tell the truth about who she was and where she came from. How could I ask her to be brave if I wasn't willing to do the same? My personal assistant buzzed through on the intercom. "Mr. Winters, there's a Dr. Martinez from Northwestern Memorial online too." My heart stopped. It had been 6 hours since the surgery began. I grabbed the phone. "Dr. Martinez, this is Leo Winters." "Mr. Winters, I wanted to update you on your daughter's condition. The surgery was successful. We were able to remove the primary tumor and begin the treatment protocol. She's in recovery now, and while it's still early, her vital signs are strong." The relief hit me like a physical force. I had to sit down. "Can I see her?" "She's still sedated, but yes. I should warn you, though, she may be confused when she wakes up. The anesthesia can cause temporary disorientation." I was already reaching for my coat. "I'm on my way." The drive to Northwestern Memorial took 23 minutes through Chicago traffic that seemed personally designed to test my patience. I'd made this trip countless times in my mind over the past few days. But actually doing it felt surreal. The last time I'd been in a hospital, I was supposedly dying. Now, I was going to see my daughter who actually had been. The intensive care unit smelled like antiseptic and hope. Sarah's room was private, thanks to the donation I'd made that morning. She looked so small in the hospital bed, connected to monitors and IV lines that tracked her vital signs with electronic precision. Her face was pale but peaceful, and for the first time in months, she didn't look like she was in pain. I pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down. Her hand was lying on top of the blanket, and after a moment's hesitation, I took it in mine. Her fingers were cold but steady. "I'm here," I said, quietly, not sure if she could hear me. "Dad's here." I stayed like that for 2 hours, just holding her hand and watching the monitors. Nurses came and went, checking her bandages and adjusting her medications. They all treated me with the professional courtesy reserved for family members of VIP patients, but I could see the curiosity in their eyes. Word traveled fast in hospitals. Around 9 p.m., Sarah's eyes fluttered open. She looked around the room with the confused expression of someone trying to remember where they were and why. When her gaze found mine, she stared for a long moment. "Dad?" Her voice was hoarse from the breathing tube. "I'm here, sweetheart." "You're really here? It wasn't a dream." "No dream." "How are you feeling?" She tried to sit up, then thought better of it. "Like I got hit by a truck, but alive. Definitely alive." A nurse came in to check her vitals and adjust her pain medication. They all treated me with the professional courtesy reserved for family members of VIP patients, but I could see the curiosity in their eyes. Word traveled fast in hospitals. Around 9 p.m., Sarah's eyes fluttered open. She looked around the room with the confused expression of someone trying to remember where they were and why. When her gaze found mine, she stared for a long moment. "Dad?" Her voice was hoarse from the breathing tube. "I'm here, sweetheart." "You're really here? It wasn't a dream." "No dream." "How are you feeling?" She tried to sit up, then thought better of it. "Like I got hit by a truck, but alive. Definitely alive." A nurse came in to check her vitals and adjust her pain medication. After she left, Sarah turned back to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I told Bradley," she said. "About what?" "About you. About who you really were before. About what I did." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He didn't take it well." I felt a familiar anger rising in my chest, but I pushed it down. This wasn't about Bradley or his reaction. This was about Sarah having the courage to tell the truth. "What did he say?" "He said I'd lied to him about something fundamental. He said he needed time to think about whether he could trust me again." She looked down at her hands. "He left about an hour before my surgery. Margaret called him when I came out of recovery, and he said he was too busy to come to the hospital." The anger I'd been suppressing flared hot and bright. Too busy. My daughter had just survived life-saving surgery, and her boyfriend was too busy to visit because she'd told him the truth about her background? "I'm sorry, sweetheart." "Don't be. You were right about him. If he can't handle the truth about where I came from, then he wasn't worth keeping anyway." She was quiet for a moment, then looked at me with an expression that reminded me of the little girl in the photo on my bookshelf. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Okay." "When you became successful, when you made all this money and gained all this influence, did you ever think about getting back at me for what I did to you?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about it seriously before answering. "Yes," I said finally. "There were moments when I imagined you finding out that I was alive and successful. I pictured you realizing what you'd thrown away. I won't lie and say the thought of you regretting your choices didn't give me some satisfaction." She nodded like she'd expected that answer. "But," I continued, "that's not why I helped you. I didn't pay for your surgery to prove a point or to make you feel guilty. I did it because you're my daughter, and despite everything that happened between us, I love you." Tears started running down her cheeks. "I don't deserve your love. I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not, but you have both anyway." She was quiet for a long time, just crying softly while I held her hand. Finally, she spoke again. "I saw the news stories about you, about your background being revealed. People are saying terrible things."
Some people are. Others are saying wonderful things. A few are saying nothing at all, which might be the most honest response. Are you okay with it? With everyone knowing? I thought about the question. Was I okay with it? The business consequences were real. Some relationships I'd valued were clearly more fragile than I'd thought. But something else was happening too. This morning, I got a call from a reporter at the Tribune, I said. She wanted to do a feature story about successful people who came from working-class backgrounds. She said there were others like me, people who'd made it but kept quiet about where they started because they were afraid of how others would react. I squeezed Sarah's hand gently. Do you know what that means? It means I'm not alone. There are other people out there hiding who they really are because they're afraid of being judged. Maybe by telling my story, I can help them realize they don't have to hide. So you're not angry about the backlash. I'm disappointed in some people I thought were better than that. But angry? No. The people who matter, the ones worth knowing, they don't care if I used to fix pipes for a living. Some of them think it's impressive that I built something from nothing. A soft knock on the door interrupted us. Margaret peeked in, carrying a small bouquet of flowers and a tired smile. "How's our patient?" she asked. "Alive and grateful," Sarah said. Margaret set the flowers on the bedside table and pulled up another chair. "I brought you something else," she said, handing Sarah a manila envelope. "These came to my house today. I think they're meant for you." Sarah opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of letters, maybe 20 or 30 of them. Her forehead creased in confusion. "What are these?" "Letters from your colleagues," Margaret said. "People you work with at the hospital. They heard about your surgery and about your father's background being revealed." Sarah's face went pale. "Oh God, what do they say? Why don't you read them and find out?" With shaking hands, Sarah opened the first letter. As she read, her expression changed from fear to surprise to something that might have been wonder. She opened another, then another. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Listen to this. It's from Dr. Peterson, the chief of cardiology." She cleared her throat and began to read. "Sarah, I heard about your father's background and wanted you to know how impressed I am. My own father was a factory worker, and I spent years hiding that fact because I was ashamed. Reading about your dad's success story makes me want to tell people about mine. Thank you for having the courage to be honest about where you came from." She opened another. This one's from Nurse Rodriguez. "My dad was a janitor who worked 3 jobs to put me through school. I never told anyone because I thought they'd think less of me. Your father sounds like a remarkable man who raised a remarkable daughter." Letter after letter, the same theme emerged. Colleagues sharing their own stories of working-class backgrounds, expressing admiration for both Sarah's honesty and my success. Doctors whose parents had been teachers, mechanics, factory workers, farmers. Nurses who'd grown up in trailer parks and housing projects. All of them hiding their backgrounds until someone else had the courage to go first. By the time Sarah finished reading the last letter, she was crying again. But these were different tears. "I thought I'd lose everything," she said. "I thought people would look down on me. And instead, I found out that most of them have been hiding the same things I was hiding. I wasn't the only one who was scared." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't seen in years. She looked peaceful. The constant tension that had defined her features since medical school was gone, replaced by something that might have been relief. "You know what the strangest part is?" she said. "What's that?" "For the first time since I started medical school, I feel like myself. Not the person I thought I needed to be, not the person I was pretending to be, just me." Margaret smiled. "That's what honesty does. It lets you stop carrying the weight of pretending to be someone else." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, Sarah drifting in and out of sleep as the pain medication did its work. Margaret eventually left to get some rest, promising to return in the morning. I stayed, dozing fitfully in the hospital chair that was clearly not designed for 6-foot-tall men. Around 3 a.m., Sarah woke up and found me stretching my back. "Dad, you don't have to stay here all night." "I want to. I missed too many nights already." She was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something else?" "Sure." "What happened to the old house, The apartment where we lived. Someone else lives there now. I drove by it a few weeks ago. They painted over the height marks on the doorframe. I used to love when you measured my height every year. You'd make such a big deal about how much I'd grown. You were always so proud of getting bigger. You said it meant you were getting closer to being grown up. She laughed softly. Turns out, growing up is a lot more complicated than getting taller. Most things are more complicated than they seem when you're 8 years old. Dad, when I get out of here, would you show me where you live now? Your real life, not just the office. I nodded. I'd like that. But I should warn you, it's pretty different from the old apartment. I don't care about the money or the fancy building. I just want to see how you live. I want to know who you are now. Who I am now is still figuring himself out, but I think I'd like your help with that. She smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her since she'd walked into my office 2 days ago. I'd like that too. Over the next 3 days, as Sarah recovered and prepared for discharge, something remarkable happened. The story of her honesty and my background had spread beyond just the medical community. The Tribune ran the feature story about successful people from working-class backgrounds, and I was quoted extensively. The article mentioned Sarah's courage in telling the truth about her family history, and suddenly she was getting interview requests from medical journals and professional organizations. They want me to speak at the Young Professionals Healthcare Summit, she told me on Thursday morning, showing me an email on her phone. The topic is authenticity in professional development. Are you going to do it? I think so. If I can help other people stop hiding who they are, maybe something good will come out of all the mistakes I made. That afternoon, Dr. Martinez cleared Sarah for discharge. The treatment had been successful, and while she'd need follow-up care for months, her prognosis was excellent. As we waited for the discharge paperwork, I called my driver to bring the car around. Dad, Sarah, as I hung up the phone, I don't need a limousine ride home. It's not a limousine, it's just a car. A car with a driver. Okay, it's a car with a driver. But you just had major surgery. I'm not putting you on the bus. She laughed, and the sound was like music. I'm not criticizing, I'm just still getting used to this version of you. Well, you'll have plenty of time to get used to it. We have a lot of catching up to do. As we rode through the city toward her apartment, Sarah stared out the window with the intensity of someone seeing familiar sights with new eyes. Everything looks different, she said. What do you mean? I don't know how to explain it. It's the same city, the same buildings, but I feel different looking at them. Like I don't have to pretend anymore that I belong here. I actually do belong here. You always belonged here, sweetheart. You just didn't believe it. When we arrived at her building, I helped her upstairs to her apartment. It was a nice place, modern and clean, but there was something sterile about it. The walls were covered with her diplomas and awards, but there were no personal photos, no mementos from her childhood, nothing that suggested she had a history before medical school. It looks like a hotel room, I said without thinking. That's because it is, basically. I never put up personal pictures because I didn't want people asking questions about my family. She walked over to her desk and pulled out a small box from the bottom drawer. Inside was the vintage medical bag I'd given her at the restaurant 3 years ago, the one she'd been too embarrassed to open in front of her colleagues. I kept it, she said. I've carried it with me through every rotation, every residency placement. It reminded me of who I really was, even when I was pretending to be someone else. She opened the bag and showed me the brass nameplate, now worn smooth from handling. I used to touch this when I was scared or overwhelmed. It made me feel like I had some kind of anchor. Looking at my daughter, standing there with the gift I'd thought she'd thrown away, I felt something shift inside my chest. The anger I'd been carrying for 3 years, the hurt and disappointment, didn't disappear, but it changed into something else, something that felt like forgiveness. I'm proud of you, I said. For what? For lying about you for years? For being too ashamed to acknowledge my own father? For being brave enough to tell the truth when it mattered? For risking everything you'd built to do the right thing? For choosing integrity over convenience? She hugged me then, carefully because of her incisions, but tightly enough that I could feel how much she meant it. I love you, Dad.
I should have said that more when I was growing up. I should have said it every day. You did say it. Maybe not with words, but you said it when you helped me carry my tools. You said it when you waited up for me after long jobs. You said it when you worked so hard in school because you knew it would make me proud. But then I stopped saying it. People make mistakes, Sarah. The measure of who you are isn't whether you make mistakes. It's what you do after you realize you've made them. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, really talking, for the first time in years. She told me about medical school, about the pressure she'd felt to fit in, about the fear that she wasn't smart enough or sophisticated enough to succeed. I told her about the loneliness of building a new identity, about the strange experience of having unlimited resources but no one to share them with.
As evening approached, I prepared to leave so she could rest. "Dad," she said as I was putting on my coat, "would you like to have dinner tomorrow night? Nothing fancy, just the two of us." "I'd love that. Should I pick you up?" She smiled. "Actually, I was thinking I could cook, if you don't mind eating in my hotel room apartment." "I don't mind at all. But fair warning, I've gotten used to pretty good food over the past few years." "Well, you're about to remember what mac and cheese from a box tastes like, because that's about the extent of my culinary skills." I laughed. Mac and cheese sounds perfect. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. I felt like a father again. Not the bitter, resentful man who'd been betrayed by his daughter. Not the successful businessman who'd built an empire on the foundation of that betrayal. But just a dad who was proud of his kid and looking forward to spending time with her. The transformation hadn't been complete when I'd gained money and power. It hadn't been complete when I'd forced Sarah to confront the truth about what she'd done. It was only complete now, when we'd both chosen to be honest about who we were and where we'd come from. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Robert, letting me know that 3 of the business relationships I'd thought were lost had reached out with renewed interest. Apparently, the story of my background had impressed them rather than concerned them. The message ended with a note that made me smile. "Also, you have 17 speaking requests from business schools who want you to talk about overcoming class barriers in professional environments." I put the phone away without responding. Business could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, I was going home to a penthouse that felt a little less empty than it had that morning, and tomorrow I was having dinner with my daughter in her apartment that would probably feel a little more like home once she put some family pictures on the walls. The man who died 3 years ago had been weak, but he'd also been loved. The man who'd been reborn had been powerful, but he'd also been alone. The man walking out of that hospital was something new entirely. Something that combined the best of both versions. He was strong enough to stand up for himself and honest enough to admit where he'd come from. He was successful enough to write checks that saved lives and humble enough to remember what it felt like to work with his hands. He was wealthy enough to demand respect and wise enough to know that the respect worth having couldn't be bought. Most importantly, he was a father again. And for Leo Winters, that was worth more than all the money Marcus had ever left him. 6 months later, I stood in the wings of the auditorium at Northwestern University, adjusting my tie and listening to the introduction that still felt surreal every time I heard it. The dean was reading my biography to an audience of 800 business students, but this version included details that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Leo Winters began his career as a licensed plumber in Riverside, working 60-hour weeks to support his family and put his daughter through medical school. Through strategic investments and an unconventional approach to market analysis, he built a portfolio worth over $300 million. Today, he serves on the boards of 6 companies and has established the Marcus Winters Foundation for Working-Class Excellence, providing scholarships and mentorship for first-generation college students. The applause that followed was different from the polite clapping I'd received at business functions over the past 3 years. This was genuine enthusiasm from young people who saw possibility in a story that didn't follow the traditional path from privilege to success. I walked onto the stage and looked out at faces that reminded me why I'd chosen to tell my story publicly. These weren't the sons and daughters of wealth who'd populated most of the events I'd attended as the mysterious investor Leo Winters. These were kids who worked part-time jobs to pay for textbooks, who came from families where a college degree was still a distant dream rather than an assumption. "How many of you have jobs right now?" I asked, instead of beginning with my prepared remarks. Hands shot up across the auditorium, easily 3/4 of the audience. "How many of you worry that your background might hurt your chances in your chosen career?" Fewer hands this time, but still substantial. "How many of you have ever been ashamed of where you came from?" The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. I could see it in their faces, the weight of feeling like they had to hide essential parts of themselves to be taken seriously. I spent the first 52 years of my life believing that my worth was determined by other people's perceptions of my profession. I spent 3 years after that believing that my worth was determined by the balance in my bank account. It took almost losing my daughter forever to understand that worth comes from something entirely different. I told them about the real Leo Winters, the one who'd crawled under houses and fixed broken pipes and felt proud of solving problems that others couldn't. I told them about the fear of not being good enough, the shame of not having the right credentials, the exhaustion of pretending to be someone else. But I also told them about the strength that came from starting at the bottom, the creativity that developed from making something work with limited resources, the empathy that grew from understanding what it felt like to be dismissed or overlooked. "The man who learned as a plumber made me a better investor," I said, watching recognition dawn on faces throughout the audience. I knew how to diagnose problems by listening carefully. I understood that the most expensive solution wasn't always the best one. I could see the structure beneath the surface, the foundational issues that others missed because they were only looking at what was visible. During the question and answer session, a young woman in the third row raised her hand. "Mr. Winters, what would you say to someone who's afraid that being honest about their background will cost them opportunities?" I thought about Sarah, who was now 6 months into her recovery and had become something of a minor celebrity in medical circles for her advocacy around authenticity in professional environments. She'd spoken at 4 conferences in the past 3 months, sharing her story of shame and redemption. I'd say that the opportunities you lose because of honesty weren't worth having. The people who would judge you for where you came from aren't the people who will help you get where you're going. After the lecture, I drove through familiar streets toward a destination that had become a monthly ritual. The cemetery where Leo Winters the plumber was supposedly buried was quiet in the late afternoon sun. I parked near the modest headstone that bore my name and sat on the bench Margaret had installed 6 months ago. The grave wasn't empty, exactly. We'd buried something there, a symbolic coffin containing items from my old life. My first toolbox, photos from the apartment, the work shirts that had carried the permanent smell of pipe compound and honest sweat. It was a funeral for the man I'd been, but also a celebration of what he'd built. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah, a habit we'd developed over the past few months. "How did the lecture go?" she asked. "Good, really good. There was a kid afterward who reminded me of myself at that age, full of questions about whether he belonged in business school." "What did you tell him?" "The same thing I wish someone had told me. That belonging isn't something you earn by changing who you are. It's something you claim by being proud of who you've always been." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Dad, I have some news. Good news or bad news?" Depends on your perspective." Bradley called today." I felt my shoulders tense automatically. Bradley had disappeared from Sarah's life completely after her revelation, too concerned about his own reputation to support her through her recovery. "What did he want?" "He wanted to apologize. Apparently, he's been following the coverage of your foundation and my speaking engagements. He said he realized he made a mistake and wanted to know if we could try again." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that some mistakes can't be fixed by apologies. I told him that when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them the first time." Pride swelled in my chest. "How do you feel about that decision?" "Free, completely free. For the first time in years, I'm not trying to be someone else's version of acceptable. I'm just being myself." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of the cemetery for a while longer. The headstone still read, "Leo Winters, beloved father," but the words meant something different now. The man buried here had been beloved, but he'd also been afraid. Afraid of not being enough, afraid of not measuring up, afraid of being seen for who he really was. The man sitting on this bench was something new entirely, something that combined the best of both versions. He was strong enough to stand up for himself and honest enough to admit where he'd come from. He was successful enough to write checks that saved lives, and humble enough to remember what it felt like to work with his hands. He was wealthy enough to demand respect, and wise enough to know that the respect worth having couldn't be bought. Most importantly, he was a father again. And for Leo Winters, that was worth more than all the money Marcus had ever left him. 6 months later, I stood in the wings of the auditorium at Northwestern University, adjusting my tie and listening to the introduction that still felt surreal every time I heard it. The dean was reading my biography to an audience of 800 business students, but this version included details that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Leo Winters began his career as a licensed plumber in Riverside, working 60-hour weeks to support his family and put his daughter through medical school. Through strategic investments and an unconventional approach to market analysis, he built a portfolio worth over $300 million. Today, he serves on the boards of 6 companies and has established the Marcus Winters Foundation for Working-Class Excellence, providing scholarships and mentorship for first-generation college students. The applause that followed was different from the polite clapping I'd received at business functions over the past 3 years. This was genuine enthusiasm from young people who saw possibility in a story that didn't follow the traditional path from privilege to success. I walked onto the stage and looked out at faces that reminded me why I'd chosen to tell my story publicly. These weren't the sons and daughters of wealth who'd populated most of the events I'd attended as the mysterious investor Leo Winters. These were kids who worked part-time jobs to pay for textbooks, who came from families where a college degree was still a distant dream rather than an assumption.
Companies wanted to work with someone who understood multiple perspectives, who could bridge the gap between boardrooms and factory floors. But the real success wasn't measured in dollars or contracts. It was measured in the letters I received from young people who'd heard my story and decided they didn't have to hide their own. It was measured in the scholarship recipients who were pursuing careers they'd never thought possible. It was measured in the relationship I'd rebuilt with my daughter, stronger now because it was based on truth rather than expectation. As I drove home through the Chicago twilight, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. I'd gained everything by losing it all, found my worth by admitting my shame, and discovered my power by acknowledging my vulnerability. The penthouse still impressed visitors, but it no longer felt like a stage set. Sarah's medical school graduation photo sat on the mantel next to a picture of the 2 of us at a construction site where the foundation was building its first training center. My office walls displayed both business awards and the original blueprints I'd drawn for pipe installations, reminders that all success builds on previous work. That evening, I had dinner with Sarah at her apartment, which had been transformed over the months into an actual home. The walls now displayed family photos spanning decades, including several of me in my work clothes that she'd printed and framed. The sterile hotel feeling was gone, replaced by the warmth of someone who was comfortable with her own history. "I've been thinking about something," she said as we cleaned up after a meal that had progressed beyond boxed mac and cheese to actual cooking. "The foundation is doing incredible work with the scholarships and training programs, but I think there's something missing." "What's that?" "Support for people who are already in professional careers but struggling with imposter syndrome. People who made it but still feel like they don't belong." I considered the idea. What would that look like? Mentorship programs, maybe? Support groups. A way for people to connect with others who understand what it's like to feel out of place in professional settings. "That's not a bad idea. Do you want to help develop it?" "Actually, I was hoping you'd let me run it. I know what it feels like to be ashamed of where you came from. I know what it costs to pretend to be someone else. Maybe I can help other people avoid making the same mistakes I made." Looking at my daughter, confident and purposeful in a way she'd never been when she was hiding her true self, I felt the final piece of my own transformation click into place. The cycle was complete. The plumber's daughter who'd been ashamed of her father was now ready to help others embrace their own backgrounds.
I think that's exactly what the foundation needs, I said. When do you want to start? 3 months later, I stood in another auditorium, but this time I wasn't the speaker. Sarah was addressing a crowd of young professionals from working-class backgrounds, sharing her story of shame, deception, and eventual redemption. The audience hung on every word as she described the cost of living a lie and the freedom that came from embracing the truth. My father taught me that all honest work has dignity, she said, and I felt tears sting my eyes. It took me years to understand what that meant and almost losing him forever to learn its value. After her speech, we walked together to the cemetery. It had become our tradition, visiting the grave of the man we'd both contributed to killing in different ways. The headstone was the same, but we'd added a small plaque next to it. He lived honestly, worked faithfully, and loved completely. His legacy continues in those who choose courage over comfort. Do you think he'd be proud of us? Sarah asked, touching the headstone gently. I thought about the man who'd raised her, who'd worked extra shifts to pay for her textbooks, who'd beamed with pride at every small achievement. That man had dreamed of his daughter becoming a doctor, but he'd also dreamed of her being happy and honest and true to herself. I think he'd be amazed, I said, not just at what we've accomplished, but at who we've become. As we walked back to the car, Sarah linked her arm through mine. Dad, do you ever regret any of it? The fake death, the years of separation, all the pain we caused each other? I considered the question seriously. The easy answer was yes, of course I regretted the pain. But the truth was more complicated. I regret that we both felt like we had to hide who we were, I said finally. But I don't regret that we found our way back to honesty. Sometimes the only way to build something strong is to tear down what was weak. The foundation thrived under Sarah's leadership of the professional development program. Within a year, they had support groups in 12 cities and a mentorship network that connected established professionals with newcomers who shared similar backgrounds. The stories that emerged from these connections reminded me daily why the work mattered. My own business continued to grow, but I was more selective about partnerships. I worked with companies that valued substance over style, results over pedigree. The work was more satisfying because it aligned with my values rather than contradicting them. 5 years after the night Margaret called begging for help, I received an invitation that stopped me cold. It was from Northwestern Memorial Hospital, asking me to speak at their annual fundraising gala. The theme was celebrating unexpected heroes, and my name was listed as the keynote speaker. But it wasn't my name that made me stare at the invitation. It was Sarah's name listed as the Master of Ceremonies, and the note at the bottom. Dr. Sarah Winters will be introducing her father, Leo Winters, founder of the Marcus Winters Foundation and proud former plumber. The night of the gala, I stood in the wings once again, but this time my daughter was at the podium introducing me to a room full of Chicago's medical and business elite. Her voice carried across the ballroom with confidence and warmth as she told our story, holding nothing back about my background, her shame, or the journey that had brought us both to this moment. My father taught me that worth isn't measured by job titles or bank accounts, she said. It's measured by the courage to be authentic, the strength to help others, and the wisdom to know that where you come from matters less than where you're going. The applause that followed was thunderous, but what moved me most was seeing faces in the audience that I recognized. Former business associates who'd initially distanced themselves when my background was revealed, now applauding enthusiastically. Medical professionals who'd found their own courage to share their stories. Young people who'd benefited from foundation programs and were now building careers without shame. When I took the podium, I looked out at a room that felt different from any I'd addressed before. This wasn't about proving anything or defending anything. This was about celebrating something. 6 years ago, I was a man so convinced of his own unworthiness that he let others erase him from existence, I began. Tonight, I stand before you as proof that resurrection is possible, that redemption is real, and that the greatest transformation comes not from changing who you are, but from embracing who you've always been. I spoke about the foundation's work, about the thousands of young people who were pursuing dreams they thought were impossible, about the professionals who'd found the courage to stop hiding their backgrounds. But mostly, I spoke about the power of truth to heal relationships, build communities, and create opportunities. The plumber who raised my daughter never dreamed his story would be told in rooms like this, I concluded. But he lived that story with integrity, worked with his hands and his heart, and raised a daughter who learned that her greatest strength came not from hiding her past, but from honoring it. As the evening wound down, Sarah and I stood together on the hospital's rooftop garden, looking out at the city lights. The same skyline I'd gazed at from my penthouse windows for years, but it looked different now. Less like a kingdom I'd conquered, and more like a community I belonged to. "Dad," Sarah said, "I have something to tell you." "Good news or bad news?" "Good news. The best news." She paused, smiling. "I'm engaged." My heart skipped, but not from worry this time. To whom? Dr. James Chen. He's a resident in pediatrics. His parents own a restaurant in Chinatown, and he's proud of it. He wants to meet you, the real you, not some sanitized version. I hugged my daughter, feeling the last of the old wounds finally heal completely. When do I get to meet him? Next week. Fair warning though, he's heard all our stories, and he's excited to meet the man who taught his future wife that authenticity is the foundation of everything worth building. Standing there with my daughter, surrounded by the city where I'd reinvented myself and then learned to be myself, I felt a completeness I'd never experienced before. The journey from shame to pride, from hiding to honesty, from isolation to connection was finally complete. The man who died in that hospital bed had been weak but loved. The man who'd been reborn had been powerful but alone. The man standing on that rooftop was something new entirely. Strong enough to be vulnerable, successful enough to remember his roots, and wise enough to know that the greatest legacy wasn't money or power, but the courage to live authentically and help others do the same. Leo Winters the plumber was finally at peace, and Leo Winters the man was finally truly alive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.